Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Halliday-Schmant, and I am the director of the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness. And today we are going to do a training on part of the homeless response system that is very important when creating opportunities for housing stability for people who are exiting homelessness and moving into supportive housing. And we call that the warm transfer process. This training also accompanies our warm transfer written standards. So all of this information we're going to be going over today is also provided in the form of written standards and forms and things that you can download and complete with your staff. So what is the warm transfer? It's the process of transferring a case from a case manager to case manager once someone has been slotted for a housing program. So in the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness, we do that slotting process and that prioritization process through our prioritization meeting, which is called the Ray Harris Group meeting. And during that time, individuals or families who are prioritized for housing slots and housing programs will be identified during that meeting. So that process kind of takes place at Ray Harris Group, but following that, it is then the process of the outreach worker making contact with the new housing-based case manager and actually transferring the case. So when transitioning from homelessness to permanent housing, it's really important that we take all of these necessary steps to be able to ensure better likelihood for housing stability. So it's best practice that if we do these warm transfer meetings exactly as we have them laid out here, folks have a better likelihood of staying in housing long term. And this process really starts, like I said, after the person has been slotted for a housing program. This could take more than one meeting. It's not necessarily happening, once in 30 minutes and then it's done. This could take a couple meetings to ensure that all of this information is transferred effectively and appropriately. So it's a collaboration between the street outreach worker and the housing-based case manager, and most importantly, the client. This process does not happen without the client. Now, the case managers may exchange information during case conferencing, or they may exchange files electronically without the client being there, ensuring that the appropriate releases of information are in place. But the majority of this transfer process happens with the client present. It's to ensure accountability on everyone's behalf. So the client has some responsibility in this, the case manager or the housing-based case manager and the outreach worker all have responsibilities when it comes to transferring the case. And it, really importantly, it gives the case managers and the client the ability to ask questions, seek clarification, and really understand what will happen next in the process of moving from homelessness into housing. Each party will lead the warm transfer process knowing what they need to do next in the process of becoming housed. So these are all the steps laid out, and these are all laid out with narrative form, both in the slides and in the written standards. But just as a kind of high-level overview, what happens during this process is the street outreach worker will initiate the meeting. So they will reach out to the housing-based case manager after the client has been slotted for that program. And they'll say, hey, we need to set up this warm transfer process. Here's the client, we kind of jump to exchange file, but with the appropriate releases of information in place, here's the client's case file, right? You'll give an HMIS number, and ideally, everything that the client needs to enter that program is uploaded into HMIS, and that's where the case can kind of start, or the warm transfer can start. Ideally, before the actual meeting takes place, the new housing-based case manager will have enough time to review the case file ask any questions, write them down, things they want to ask the client, things they want to ask the outreach worker. Some of that can be done via email prior to the meeting, or it can be done in real time during the meeting. But ideally, the housing-based case manager will have the ability to look over the case prior. During the actual meeting, since the outreach worker has the relationship already established with the client, they will initiate the meeting. They will set up a time that works for the client and the housing-based case manager, where all three parties can meet in person. The outreach worker will then make the introductions and say, hi, this is my friend James, who is the housing-based case manager. Great person, great program, blah, blah, kind of set the stage for the trusting relationship to continue with the client and the new case manager. The explanation will happen of the program, how it's different than street outreach work. They'll set the next meeting. If maybe this one transfer will take several meetings, they'll do that, or not. Maybe it happens in one meeting, and now it's up to the housing-based case manager to set the next meeting. That just kind of depends on how the case is going. So during the meeting, you'll actually establish and review the housing plan. Likely it'll be review. So if the program does not come with a unit and the client needs to search for a unit, there's some information that will be exchanged, but we'll get into that in a second. You'll summarize the entire meeting, meaning who does what next. You'll document that as the outreach worker, and the housing-based case manager will document that this process occurred in HMIS. There's a transfer checklist that needs to be completed and reviewed. And then most importantly, the SPDAT needs to be reviewed during the WARM transfer. So we'll get into that in a second. So going into more detail, I've already talked about what the introduction looks like. The explanation, that's important. So the explanation is the part of the process where the client gets to ask a lot of questions, and it's where the housing-based case manager for the first time gets to explain the housing program to the client. This is ideally when the participation agreement from the housing program is given to the client. The client has a chance to review it. Maybe they want to take it with them, review it, really understand the program, and come back with more questions. That's absolutely fine. But this is where what the program looks like is discussed. And here is where you want to stop often as case managers to seek clarification, make sure that the client is tracking right along with you two about what the program looks like and how that's different from the work that they've previously done with the case manager in street outreach. This part will have already happened, but the exchange of the file has already happened. Setting the next meeting happens at the end. Sorry, these are kind of out of order. But reviewing the housing plan, I do want to talk about that. So I have review the housing plan in here because ideally, if the client is working with street outreach before they get housed, the housing plan is something that already exists. It's either a housing plan or it's the housing, or I'm sorry, it's either the housing search checklist, which we'll look at in this training, or it's the housing inventory checklist, or it's kind of both. Best practice is it's both. And this really needs to be done if the client is going into a housing program like rapid rehousing, for example, that usually does not come with a unit designated. So that's a whole different process. If a unit has been identified, this is kind of this review of the housing plan happens if it's a scattered site program, and the housing search still needs to continue after the client has been referred to housing-based case management. So that takes place, and we'll go over those forms in a second. Like I said, both case managers are documenting this, that this occurred in HMIS, and that really helps to like formalize the process, that the case has been transferred. Maybe outreach is going to stick around for a week or two to really solidify the warm transfer. Maybe that doesn't need to happen, and outreach can now go ahead and close the case. If they're moving into a unit, the relationship has been transferred, the case has been transferred, and we're done. But it just kind of depends on the case. And then what we'll spend a little bit more time here is talking about the SPDAT. So the SPDAT review is essential in having a successful warm transfer. It helps the client understand, or not understand, but it helps the client articulate what they would like to work on in housing. It helps the housing-based case manager understand kind of where the client's at today as opposed to what their goals are for the future in housing. It also gives the case management staff the opportunity to ask the client's questions and seek clarification, right? So this is the first time the client's really been able to say, I want to work on X, Y, and Z when we get into housing. And it really kind of furthers the idea that having supports when you're housed helps you maintain your housing, and it increases the likelihood that the person will stay housed long-term and ideally permanently, right? So while the person was still experiencing homelessness, the street outreach worker will have already completed a SPDAT, and that was the assessment that really helped prioritize this case to get into the housing program. So this is the case, the outreach worker and the client having already completed the full SPDAT, and now we're going to sit down and review it. Now, I will say there's one caveat here. The more transparent the client and the case managers can be about this process, the better. But sometimes relationships take time. Sometimes there's things that we need to consider in order for this to be successful, like maybe the client isn't ready to talk about everything listed on that full SPDAT, and that's okay. They can have the opportunity to do that while they're in housing with their new housing-based case manager. This is really just setting the stage and letting all three parties know what's to be worked on from the client's perspective once they get into housing. So I hope that makes sense. That's something you can really talk with your supervisors about, but we want to be sure we're not talking about things that the client is very, very uncomfortable with to the degree that it will harm the relationship before it's already started. But you do want to create transparency to the degree necessary and the degree available to you from what the client and you have discussed. So beyond the full SPDAT, and I should also say, I'm going to go back one more slide. So I should also say in this full SPDAT review, you're going over the full SPDAT and where the client wants to work on things, what progress they've made. You want it to be really strengths-based, and you're handing this over to the new case manager. What you also want to do here is to make sure that the client knows this is what they've determined they want to work on in housing. And so both case managers can really kind of amplify that and help support the client through that. Okay, so now we get into the warm transfer checklist. The top portion of this are all the documents that need to be uploaded or recorded in HMIS by the outreach staff prior to the warm transfer meeting. And here we're talking about uploading their ID, uploading and making sure everything is current in terms of the ROI or the release of information. There needs to be a current verification of homelessness. So this will differ depending on what housing program they're going in. If this person is going into, going into housing on the Housing Choice Voucher, some of these things will be different per the MSHDA voucher requirements. So this isn't like completely black and white, meaning every program is different, right? But for like ESG rapid rehousing, they're going in that program, we need the last 30 days of income. You always, always need the full SPDAT. You always need the verification of homelessness, the release of information to be up to date, and the ID. ID also, we could sometimes, housing-based case managers can work on that, but likely we have at least the HMIS ID that can be shown. For Northwest Michigan Supportive Housing, they need a verification of disability. For Northwest Michigan Supportive Housing, they need a verification of chronicity. Some programs will also require the verification of veteran status, if that's applicable. The bottom half of this is just to make sure that all of these discussions are being had. So this can act as kind of a guide for the warm transfer. So it's the program participant, participant agreement, and that is led by the housing-based case manager. This will depend on the housing program, what this looks like, but the participant agreement for the housing program will be discussed. The full SPDAT review will be done during this, and that's led by the street outreach workers, since they are the ones who will have conducted it the first time. I should also say in there, it's also led by the client, right? So the client is going to have the opportunity to say what they want to work on. If this is applicable, the housing-based case manager will talk about shared housing. So if it's a scattered site program and shared housing is an option, we always want to be talking about that with the client. Is that something they're open to? Really normalize the process of shared housing and what that can look like. All three parties will talk about communication expectations. So for example, if it's a scattered site housing placement and housing search will continue after the warm transfer process, like there's not a unit identified, outreach and housing-based case management and the client will set the expectations, like who's looking for housing, who's working on referrals for basic needs, who's taking the lead on housing, what happens if I find a unit. All of those things are covered in communication expectations. Contact information in local areas the client can be found if the phone is not feasible. So if they don't have a phone, where can the housing-based case manager find the client while they're looking for housing? Does that need to go through outreach? What information can outreach and the client provide to make that process easier? Housing search and identification. Oh, we already talked about that, and we'll talk about it more in a second. And finally, clarifying and discussing continued supportive housing, supportive roles with the client. So we talked about that too. What is housing-based case management going to do versus what is outreach going to do while the client works on becoming housed? And then here's those roles and responsibilities that we briefly touched on. So these are generally things that street outreach will continue to provide until the client is in housing. But shelter entry, if they're living unsheltered and they want to try to get into shelter while they wait for housing, that's something street outreach covers. Referrals to where community meal sites are, same thing with clothing pantries, referrals to clothing pantries, access to physical and mental health, transportation and benefit management, all those kind of like basic needs, and the coordination of that for people experiencing chronic homelessness is all on street outreach. Until they get housed, and then the transfer of that case and all of these services then goes to the housing-based case manager. We'll talk about housing search. That street outreach worker can also provide a Goodwill store voucher for move-in supplies. They can provide a welcome home basket for the client, so can the housing-based case manager. And then finally, engagement support to help build that rapport with the housing-based case manager. And that can go on for a period of time if needed. But if not, the warm transfer is really where that relationship transfer happens. And then the roles of the housing-based case, or the role of the housing-based case manager includes things like housing search, contacting landlords, helping fill out housing applications. And I will say this can also be on the street outreach worker. It can kind of transition based on the case, but primarily the housing-based case manager is doing all these things with the client while they look for housing. Again, caveat here is these are for places where, or programs where the unit isn't identified yet. And then they can help coordinate funding for rental application fees, security deposit, that sort of thing. A housing-based case manager can help coordinate apartment showings with the client, contact landlords to provide information on the housing program. They need to be present at the lease signing. They can be present for a move-in basket. They can help facilitate that. And then they help get move-in supplies and furniture. So this is how the housing search checklist. It's probably a little bit small on your screen, but it's included in the written standards. And this is a form that should be shared with the client and all support workers assisting in the housing search. So again, for clients who do not have a housing unit already identified to go with the housing program. You're going to talk with the client about things like how much income is available for rent. If this is subsidized, what will that look like? Who would you like to live in the housing? What is the minimum number of bedrooms? Does it need to allow pets? Are you already on housing waiting lists, and where? And so that's kind of that inventory checklist that outreach can provide. Are there safety concerns that limit housing options? What does the housing need to be in proximity of? Supports, transportation, that sort of thing. What does shared housing look like? What rent limit are they needing to be within? All of that stuff you guys can read. These are all things that need to be completed and handed over and completed kind of with the client, the outreach worker, and the housing-based case manager. And then I'll also say it's also inclusive of the housing inventory checklist that outreach has, that has all of the income-based housing in the area. Maybe they've applied to non-income-based housing where they would maybe use a voucher or a subsidy. Goodwill Outreach has that checklist that will also be provided to the housing-based case manager. And then finally, I want to just really take a moment to stress why we do this and how we do this. So the values of the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness are collaboration, accountability, and data-driven decision-making. And those values can really overlay everything that we do from homelessness to housing, right? So this work takes constant collaboration, communication, and accountability on everyone's behalf. So what we're really asking here is to act as if the street outreach worker and the housing-based case manager are sharing an office. You all work for the same team, the coalition, and the same purpose to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time. And if we kind of remember that, this process goes a lot smoother. If we remember we are doing this to end homelessness, kind of where we can get caught up in the weeds a little bit on who's doing what, that process goes a lot smoother when we think about everything on this slide. So that's where I will end it today. Like I said, this training video can accompany the slides as well as the written standards for the warm transfer. And then your supervisors can also act as a support person and a trainer. And if you need to kind of collaborate with another agency to get this done, they can help support that work. So I want to also just take one more moment to thank you for this incredibly important and difficult work that you are all doing. It matters, it matters, it matters. And thank you so much for the work you're doing to end homelessness in Northwest Michigan.